Hello, good morning, everyone. So, thanks very much, Chris. Like Chris says, Peter McCready, I'm a solution architect within the Novascope team, and I'm going to talk a bit about Windows Virtual Desktop today. Quick bit about me, first of all. I've been working in IT for 20 years now or thereabouts. Through that time, I've kind of worked through a range of roles in primarily in the IT infrastructure space. So, I spent a lot of time working with the likes of compute, network, storage, infrastructure. Was around and heavily involved in a lot of virtualization projects and initiatives. And whenever that first kicked in 10 or 15 years ago, and over the last 5 or more years, that's kind of evolved into cloud, and which is where I spend the majority of my time now. So I kind of focus on Microsoft Cloud Solutions and hold a number of certifications, some of which up on the screen there. And if anyone's on LinkedIn and wants to connect in with me, that's my profile link at the bottom there. You'll be able to find me. So what we're going to cover today, I'm going to set the scene first of all with the current position of where things are. I'm going to talk a bit about remote desktop services as it is traditionally known, and as a precursor to then talking about Windows Virtual Desktop on Azure, and before going on to some of the benefits of that service and how it's costed. Like Chris said, we'll have time for a bit of QA at the end, and depending on how we're doing on time, I'll try to get a bit of a demo of the service in there as well. Where we're at right now, strange world that we're all living in. According to the Office for National Statistics, last month, 49.2% of adults in employment in the UK were working from home. So that's obviously an incredibly high number, fueled by the COVID-19 pandemic. But it's also a number that, whilst it's going to come down, it's going to end up being much higher than what it has been prior to the pandemic as well. So whatever the new normal is going to be that everyone's trying to get their head around, we fully expect that we're going to see much more people working from home in not just the short term, but in the medium to long term in the future. So that's something that we think employees will want, and almost certainly employers will want as well. I think once people get in the habit of working from home, we might find employers start thinking, well, do we need huge offices with hundreds or thousands of seats, or can we do with a portion of the workforce working from home? So the question then becomes, how can we facilitate those remote workers? Remote working in itself isn't a new thing. It's been around for a while, and what's new at the minute, or what's made this more present, is the sheer volume of it at the minute. But some of the challenges that are associated with it will be well known. So device management, anyone working from home needs to have a device that they can use to access their working environment, whatever that may be. That it needs to be security provisioned, so that IT can be comfortable that there's no undue risk. Any applications that people use for their business work will need to be installed and maintained. Users need to have access to the data that they need in order to do their work. So that access needs to be quick and reliable. But just as important, the company needs to make sure that that data is securely provided. So with people accessing from home, that can't be done in a way that puts any of the data at risk, which is often the most important thing within an organization. From a performance perspective, the user environment that people are working within needs to perform adequately, which is to say that it needs to be on a par with the kind of environment that they would be used to working with when they're in an office, for example. So if people are going to have to use an environment that is much worse, then that's going to be problematic. Network latency is something that needs to be kind of considered and factored in here as well, because you have, for example, some applications that won't deal well with network latency between different locations, and that's often an issue that isn't manifested whenever people are working within offices, because you'll have internet and WAN connectivity that will be well known and well predictable and will have low latency, whereas when people are working remotely or from home, then typically what we're relying on is people's broadband connectivity, which is different in its nature to the type of WAN connectivity you'll have in an office, but also much less predictable. Security clearly needs to underpin everything that happens, from devices through data and even network traffic being knocked about between different locations. It all needs to be done securely, and the price for the convenience of working from home can't be compromised security. So these are all the typical types of challenges that we've seen over the years with remote working, and still the case at the minute. Before I go on to talk a bit about the remote desktop services architecture that I'm going to talk about as it is right now, quick bit about terminology. So there's going to be a range of terms that you'll either have heard or will hear, or that I might jump in and out of. And largely they don't matter. So we just want to set the scene with that. So you hear things like desktop virtualization or virtual desktop infrastructure or remote desktop services, and they're broadly speaking all the same thing. So it's often differences between vendors. So we're a Citrix and VMware partner as well, and as well as Microsoft, and they all have their own offerings. They've all got slightly different terminology around those offerings, but from a technology perspective and from an architecture perspective, they're all broadly the same. There's not a great deal of difference between them. So you'll also hear things like application virtualization or remote app, when that's just the remote delivery of an application as opposed to a desktop environment. So whilst I'm going to use the terminology from the Microsoft solution, the same kind of architecture and the same kind of principles apply to other solutions also. So this is the architecture of a kind of basic deployment of Microsoft Remote Desktop Services. There are multiple server rules. You can see a number of them lined across the top above the blue line in the diagram there: the connection broker, licensing server, gateway, and web servers. And they're all basically there to facilitate access to the session host, which is in the bottom right-hand corner of that diagram. That session host or session hosts is what facilitates the desktops or the applications, actually runs them, that people will log on to and connect and consume. Some other technical requirements along with that is that you need to have file services, either a server or something else in some shape or form to facilitate things like user profiles. You need to have Active Directory for identity and authentication. You need to have load balance to facilitate traffic being routed between multiple servers. And you need to have a firewall to bring in traffic from the outside internet and punch holes basically from the internet through to the internal network. It's worth noting in this kind of basic deployment model that all of the server rules that we have highlighted there are single points of failure. So if you lose any one of those servers for whatever reason, you've got problems with your service. There's a highly available architecture, which does away with the single points of failure, but at the cost of complexity. So you basically double it up on a lot of the servers, which means that you then need many more servers, at least 10 for this particular architecture, resulting in increased resource consumption. So that means that if you have an on-premise deployment, you're basically carving out a higher portion of that for this service. If you're running that within a public cloud service or any as a service offering, then that increased consumption is going to result in higher costs for you. There's additional software. So in particular, whilst there's additional Windows Server licenses within this model, often they're factored into your costs at the hardware level, but the SQL costs here, if you're looking to provide SQL in a highly available manner, then what you're probably talking about is multiple SQL nodes with an always-on cluster, and SQL licensing can be expensive. So all in all, it's a similar, albeit more complex model. If you're okay with the complexity, even when you get past that, there's still an additional overhead of running that stuff. So those 10 VMs, they still all need to be updated. You still have to have business continuity measures like backup, disaster recovery in place for them. You still have to manage all your certificates, and you have to make sure that you've got the appropriate RDS licenses for every device or user that's accessing the service. So is there a better way to do it? And this is what Windows Virtual Desktops on Azure tries to achieve. So it runs on Azure, which means that you can leverage Azure scale and reach, providing effectively limitless capacity. There's the current count is 58 regions operating globally. That number is growing all the time. There's a stream of new regions being brought on as we speak, and it pay-as-you-go economics, so you pay for as much or as little as you use. The remote desktop architecture itself is much simplified, so under the covers it's largely the same, but what's different is that Microsoft manages a lot of the management components with Windows Virtual Desktops, and means that then the customers look after their desktop or applications and the data that interact with them. So I'll talk a bit about those two things. So why would you choose Azure for your public cloud deployments? I mentioned scale and reach. So limitless capacity effectively. And the 58 regions mean that you're much more likely to get a region that's close to you, which can be important when it comes to things like network latency. That's all well and good if you're looking to build globally distributed applications. The reality of it is that most of our customers are not looking to do that. So I'm going to zoom in here a bit to the European regions. So within Europe, we can see here there's 8 regions online currently, and a further 6 being planned or being built that have been announced. And where we see the majority of our customers working is in the UK and Irish spaces. So these two regions right here, it's UK South and UK West, and this blue dot right here is North Europe, which is hosted in Dublin. So to kind of put it into perspective what that North Europe Dublin facility looks like, this is an aerial shot of Azure North Europe. So this is one single blue dot on that previous diagram that we were looking at. What we see here is a range of different facilities all within this one region. So they're split up into different availability zones, they're referred to as. There's 3 availability zones within Azure North Europe. Each of those availability zones has their own connections to the electricity grids. They've got their own backup generators. They're operated completely independently of each other, but you can architect your solutions to span across those availability zones so that if you had a problem with one of them, it shouldn't affect your other services and so on. So it would take a seriously catastrophic failure in that geography in order to knock out all of those regions or all of those availability zones within the region. The other kind of key benefits of Azure really is it's some of the things that we see is that it's the flexibility of the options available. So the vast majority of our customers are using Microsoft in some shape or form, whether it's on-premise servers, whether it's Office 365 or a combination of both. And Azure plugs into that ecosystem, so you can run hybrid environments using site-to-site VPNs with your existing, connecting your existing network to Azure. And the identities that you already use to authenticate the Office 365, for example, it's the same identities that you would use to manage your resources within Azure. You can use as much or as little as you want, meaning you pay for as much as little as you want. And you can mix and match from the portfolio of infrastructure, platform, and software as a service offerings. So typically what we see people doing is taking the infrastructure as a service platform or solutions first of all, and then over time kind of transitioning that to some of the platform or software as a service offerings. So a typical example of that would have been previously people would have run Exchange on premise, and over time that has kind of moved, and now the majority of people that are using Exchange do it via Office 365. They've moved away from infrastructure and into the software as a service space. In terms of the kind of accreditation that these facilities have, they're as well accredited as any hosting facility that you'll get anywhere. So Microsoft, I put a link down there to the Microsoft Trust Center, which is where Microsoft kind of document everything that they do for these, everything that they do in terms of compliance and regulatory requirements, in order to demonstrate how well run that they are. So if, for example, and by using or consuming services within these, we as customers then get to get access to that as well. So if, for example, you need to provide evidence for ISO 27001, you can go to the Microsoft Trust Center. They'll tell you what they do, but not only will they tell you what to do, you can get access to the audit reports and you can download the certificate, and you can actually submit and share that with your own auditor should you need to. So there's a load of resources on that Trust Center site, organized by kind of geographies and region and sector. You can see it by, by UK or by payment card industry or whatever it is you might want to see. Massive amount of cloud native services already available, but just as importantly, there's continuous wave of innovation going on. That means that those services are evolved and improved over time, and also new services come to the market, which is actually what Windows Virtual Desktop itself is, new service. So what exactly is it, or are the key messages with it? So one of the headline features is multi-session Windows 10. Anyone who's used remote desktop services in the past will know that you can have multiple users logging onto a Windows server, and depending on your licensing, that can be as many users as you need really. But anyone who wants to log on to like a Windows 10 device, you can only have one user logged on at any one time. That changes in Windows Virtual Desktop. It's the only way that you can have Windows 10 multi-session, but you can have multiple users actively using Windows 10. That's significant for a couple of reasons. One is that it's a much more familiar user environment for users, in that they will see and kind of be comfortable with the Windows 10 environment, whereas they might not necessarily be comfortable with logging on the server environment. And the fact that you can have multiple sessions is significantly lower cost than running multiple machines for every user that you need to provide them for. The service has been kind of built and deeply integrated with Office 365 throughout. The things like there's a built-in image with Office 365 Pro Plus that simplifies the activation and license management. For example, there was also an acquisition of a company called FS Logics. They were really well known and well respected in the virtual desktop infrastructure space generally. Microsoft acquired them about a year ago and have built their technology into the Windows Virtual Desktop service. Effectively means that the performance is much better than what it would be otherwise, and also that profiles are persisted across multiple machines, whereas they wouldn't normally be without something like that. You can still do remote desktops and remote apps. So if you want a full desktop environment, you can do that. If you just want to provision an application to someone, you can do that also, or you can do some combination of them both. There's also a tool that you can use to, if you have an existing RDS deployment on premise, there's a migration tool that you can use to kind of evaluate and assess, give you a cost estimate, and do a migration to bring that into the Windows Virtual Desktop service. And again, because this is an Azure service, you can deploy and scale it easily and without upfront CapEx. So you can plug it in, you can integrate it with your existing environment for the likes of your identities, your own Active Directory. But you can start small. So you can plug into your own services, you can spin up one host, test it out for a few users, satisfy yourself that it does what it needs to do, and then scale it up. And if for whatever reason then you need to reduce that capacity as well, you can also bring that back down. So who does what then? And which parts are managed by Microsoft versus a customer? So basically Microsoft manages all of the management functions that were above the blue line in our original diagram. So the web access, gateway, connection broker, load balance, and diagnostics and management features are all run by Microsoft as a service within the Azure platform. So we don't need to provide any VMs or do any configuration for any of those things. The customer then is responsible for the session host. So that's the server or servers that would provide the desktop environment or the applications that will be running, and obviously the access to data within those applications as well. Because you're running these in Azure, those session hosts that you run, whilst you're responsible for the configuration of that session host operating system and any applications within it, it's running on the Azure's infrastructure as a service offering. So the actual physical compute, storage, and network infrastructure that facilitates that is also managed by Microsoft as part of the service. So again, you've got a much kind of reduced realm of responsibility when delivering the service. So key reasons then for going with Windows Virtual Desktop: massively scalable. You can start small and grow it as you need to wherever you want to. Just as importantly, you can shrink it back down. So if, for example, you have seasonal requirements or an ongoing pandemic, you can grow it to be as big as you need to be. Whenever you have a less of a requirement for people working remotely, you can drop that back down again, and by shrinking that capacity, it reduces your costs as well. Highly secure. So all of the traffic that goes across the internet is secured using SSL. So it's all encrypted traffic. You can prevent data from being leaked or stored onto local devices that people are using. And there's also no requirement any longer for punching holes through your firewall back into the environment that you have. So any of the connectivity from the session hosts between session hosts and users is reverse proxied through the Microsoft service using outbound connectivity from the session host as opposed to inbound connectivity. So that basically means that there's no hole open for any attacker on the internet to try to exploit. Cost effective. So the Windows 10 multi-session in particular is extremely competitive in its pricing because of the fact you don't have to have multiple machines and you can match your capacity to what you need. Whereas if you were doing this in a typical on-premise type solution, you would have to match your capacity to your peak requirement. And the fact that there's no CapEx requirement up front as well means that the cost of trying out and getting started with the system the solution is very small. Easy to manage. So up until there was an update that came out for the service last month. It'll be referred to as the spring update, where pretty much all of the management features have been brought into the Azure portal. Prior to that, quite a lot of it was done via PowerShell. It all worked and it was fine, but it's basically easier to manage now and it's easier to make changes. So I'll try and show a bit of that shortly. How much is the cost? So the costs are made up of two elements. In order to kind of explain those elements, what I'm going to do is put the original diagram that we had back up, and I'm going to draw an imaginary line across the middle. So if you consider everything above that red line, that is the services that's provided by Microsoft. They're provided as a service within Azure. There's no cost for that service. In order to access it, you need to have an eligible license for each of the users who want to access it. So those eligible licenses are on the screen there. It's basically Microsoft 365 licenses, Business Premium, E3, E5, or Windows 10 Enterprise, E3, E5, or the academic education equivalents of those licenses. If any users don't have those licenses, you can supplement the licenses they have by purchasing a VDA license, and that allows them to get access through the management service at top. But all of those things that you previously would have had to run multiple VMs for and look after configuration management yourself, it's now all managed as a service, which is a big improvement. The second element then is the Azure consumption costs, and really the cost of that is it depends really on each customer specific requirements. So it'll come down to the number of session hosts that you need to run, the size and configuration of those hosts, the amount of storage that you need, any particular network requirements that you might have, if you want to back those up, and if you're backing them up for how long. Those things all have an impact on cost because it's a consumption-based model. So the more of those things that you consume, the higher the cost will be, and consequently the lower the cost will be. I'm going to jump across very quickly and do a bit of a demo and hope that the demo gods are good to me. So what I'll show first of all here is this is a domain controller for an on-premise environment, and I've got some groups set up here, 3 groups, one of them for desktops, one of them for 365 desktops, and one of them for applications. I've got a number of users set up here who are members of those groups, and those groups are then synchronized to the cloud using Azure AD Connect. So this is the cloud, the Azure AD environment for this particular company, Greenfield Traders. So I've got my users here. You'll see the same users, and it'll tell me that they're synced from the Windows Server Active Directory. And we've got the same groups again synced up. So the membership of those groups are synchronized up in the on-premise Active Directory. The significance of that is that you don't have to set this stuff up from new. This will plug in with what you already have in terms of group management if that's what you want. So in order to access the service, then there's a URL we connect to. I'm logged in here as Homer. Let me get Marge up as well. So I'm going to demonstrate this using the web connectivity. That's perfectly fine, but you don't have to use the web connection as well. There's also a connection mechanism using the Windows Remote Desktop Client built into Windows 10. And there is also support for iGel Thin clients, and there's a list of other thin client vendors that are currently going through the process of getting certified as well. So this is a prompt for multi-factor authentication, which hasn't been set up yet for Marge here. So within my Active Directory, I had a couple of desktop groups, and you'll see that Marge is a member of both of them. So the Windows Virtual Desktops and the 365 Desktops group. So when she logs in then, there's 2 different desktops that she sees and has access to. And if I was to click onto one of them, allow access to local resources. At this point now, that first authentication that came through, that was me authenticating through the Microsoft service that Microsoft provide. And this second authentication now is me connecting to the actual VM itself. That's her logging in. And I'm just going to quickly do the same thing for Homer. So that's me logged in there at the minute. If I was to launch an application, you see all the stuff that you would expect to see, but probably more interestingly, this is what you normally would not see within a Windows environment. So I can see there's currently 2 users logged in here. Marge is a current user, but she can see that there is Homer logged on to another session. And I'm just going to see the converse of that on the other session. So if I log in as Homer, I can see Homer and all the stuff that he's running. But we can also see that Marge is there and active as well. So that's the desktop environment quickly. Homer also has access to some of the applications. So if I launch one of these, now what's actually happening here at the minute is the application are run not on a Windows 10 machine, but I've set them up to run from a Windows server. So I've set up I wanted to demonstrate an application that would only run on the server. So I've set up the server manager application here to run, and Homer will then be able to see that. If we take a look then, so we can see the stuff that you would see with the server. What you would, this is a tried example. What you would typically do here is that you would have whatever your kind of core line of business application is that you want to publish out, that's what you would be publishing here. You can see the computer name at the top is GFT-app-0. Whereas if I go and log on to the desktop environment that Homer's looking at, you can see the host that he's connected to there is the GFT-365-0. So 2 different hosts, one providing the desktop environment using Windows 10, the other one providing the application environment. So that is the service quickly. So how can we help? At NovaSchool, we're a Gold partner, Microsoft Gold partner, have been for many years across a range of competencies within the Partner Network program. Up on the screen there at the minute are some of the competencies that are relative to the cloud services that we offer. Our services kind of fall into 3 categories. First one being plan, which is typically consultancy services, where we go out, we'll engage with customers to discuss requirements, take a look at what they have, assessments of their existing solutions, and then work through solution design to meet whatever the requirements are. Beyond that, we've got in the build phase, professional services around typically installation or migration services. And finally, then we offer complete managed service offerings for our cloud solutions. And there's a range of different tiers of service that we have within that as well in order to match whatever the requirements might be. So that's everything from me as far as talking through it. I have gone over by a couple of minutes, but we've still got some time for any questions if there are any. Feel free to jump on audio or in chat, whichever works better.
Gary asked, can you enable pass-through instead of entering details twice?
Yeah, yes. So sorry, I should have said that. Thanks for calling that out, Jerry. The lab environment that I've set up here has a on-premise domain and a cloud-based tenant, but I don't have a single namespace between the two at the minute, which is why I was getting prompted for authentication twice. So the answer to your question is yes. That's why it looked the way it looked in my demonstration there. But yeah, I meant to say that. So thanks for calling it out.
Okay, so there's one more question in there. What's involved in packaging up applications to make them available on the desktop? That's a good one.
So in order to make the applications available, by default, it'll see anything that you have that's available either by the start menu or that you can provide a file path to. In order to make it available, you basically go through the installation. So you install it on the server, and then through the Azure portal, you can then choose it either by file path or shortcut, whichever works best. In order to have that deployed across multiple machines, it's the same options that you would have with any of the other solutions as well. So there's a couple of different ways you can do it. You can either deploy it via MSI, or you can have like a gold image type solution and deploy your session host from that. So similar kind of options, the same options really as you would have with certainly with the on-premise RDS solutions and typical kind of offerings as to the other vendors equivalents as well.
Cool, thanks for that, Peter. In terms of how many companies are suddenly having to rapidly scale up their processes for this, what are some of the common problems you'd expect people to be facing?
It differs hugely across companies, so it kind of depends on where you're at and with your, I hate using the term cloud journey, but it kind of fits here. So if, for example, you're an organization who are already using Microsoft 365, then the leap to go from that to using something like Windows Virtual Desktop is much less than if you're an organization who don't use that, because you've got licensing implications and you've probably got user education to do if you have to move to that model. Similarly, if you're an organization who's also using or already using remote desktop in some shape or form, remote desktop or Citrix or VMware Horizon or something like that, then again the change to Windows Virtual Desktop is fairly small. Whereas if it's people who are used to working in an office with a desktop that they don't do things remotely with typically, then that's a bigger leap. So it kind of depends on the organization and what they're comfortable with and what they're not comfortable with. It can be really easy for some people. It can be a bit more of a kind of leap and more of a need for education with others.
So this one is, if I understood correctly, we can connect to a server farm back on site at our premises to use services as opposed to host it on our services. I think I've understood that question right. Does that make sense to you, Peter?
Is there any chance Martin could come on the audio and maybe elaborate on that? I'm not sure I fully understand the question.
Hi, Martin. Welcome to the webinar.
Hi guys, how you doing? Okay, so we host ERP in our own server farm on premise at the moment.
Yeah.
We also use remote desktop to get to that. If we were to push this out into the cloud, can we then create some sort of site-to-site VPN that will enable that to continue to work?
So yes and no. The real answer is not really. So what you need to do is you can't publish an application that's run on an on-premise server via the Windows Desktop service, if that's the question that you're looking to ask. However, you can publish that application in the same way, hosted in Azure as part of the Windows Desktop service or Windows Virtual Desktop service, and there is a migration tool that will do that migration for you. So it wouldn't necessitate then the need for the likes of a site-to-site VPN, but you would achieve the same thing, and actually you would probably do it in a better performant way as well, because if you were to try and do that across a site-to-site VPN, you're obviously introducing the latency then between that front-end service and the session host. So that's the reason why they don't provide that offering at the minute.
So effectively, you're saying we would have to move the application from on-premise to Azure Cloud SimForm,
yeah. The session hosts need to run in Azure.
Okay, got it. All right, sorry that question wasn't clear.
No worries. No, thanks very much for explaining.
Thanks, Martin. So we have another one there. Are there limits on the size of the gold image?
So not beyond what the limits would be within Azure typically. So unless there's a no is probably the answer to your question, but not knowing how big your image is, I hesitate just to say that point blank.
Is that a challenge accepted?
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, look, there's not limits other than what the compute and storage limits are associated with the machines at the minute. So I don't know how familiar you are with Azure, but if, for example, there's the size of disks and the quantity of disks that you can assign to an image differ by the family of VMs, and whenever you run these hosts within Azure, you can use any of the family of VMs that you want. So some servers, for example, will only allow you to add. You might have a server that has 2 CPUs and 8 GB of RAM, and you can add 4 disks to it. Whereas a server from another family might have 8 CPUs and 64 GB of memory, and you can add 32 disks. So there's kind of limitations within the Azure structure as it is for what you can do with VMs. But beyond that, there's no additional limits as to what you can do with your gold image. There's a question there from Patrick Daly, which is a really good question that I've heard a number of times before. So I'll maybe just answer that one quickly if we can, at least as much as is possible. Is there a recommended or max desktop size? So as with all these things, the answer is it depends. and therefore no, there's not a recommended one that fits for everyone. There is, however, some guidance as to, depending on the size and profile of user that you have, they recommend this number of users per CPU core, and you can infer from that then the types of machines that will be the best fit for that. So again, similarly how some of the other vendors approach this, they have the concept of standard users, power users, you know, and light users, and depending on the profile and quantity of the users that you have, then that will spit out a number of, well, you need this number of this type of machine or that number of that type of machine, for example. So it varies depending on whatever the requirements are, but there are some guidelines, and we can share some links and collateral for that if it helps as well.
Thanks for that. So yeah, there's no other questions there that I can see. So if you do have anything else, you can email Peter or marketing@novasco.com, and Lisa or myself will email everyone in the next day or two with a link to the webinar, the slides, and just a thanks for attending. So other than that, Peter, thanks for your time. Everyone, thanks for joining. Have a great day.
Thank you.